What is there new to say or write or ponder about the 60s?
Well, I think that especially during this time that we're going through, it was worth remembering that a lot of what we're dealing with now began in the 1960s. Began with political polarization, for example. The 60s really did give rise to the phrase, the political is personal, or the personal is political. That came out of the women's movement, and then gay rights and a lot of other special interest groups that organized themselves politically around one or two issues. And that has defined our politics, both for good and for ill, for the last 40 years or so. And the 1960s made it possible for Barack Obama to be elected president of the United States. The man whose name is on this building, Lyndon Johnson, passing the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Bill, made it possible for an African American, not just of his exceptional standards and qualities, to take their rightful place in America. So the 60s still resonate in a lot of ways for us. We became a nation divided about military action as a result of the 1960s. As a direct result of the 1960s, we have an all-voluntary military now, not a draft anymore, because it wasn't politically feasible. So I thought it was worth going back and re-examining some of those issues, hearing what people who went through that time had to say about where they might have gone wrong or what they're proud of, and what people who took advantage of the 60s politically, what they had to say.
You were working as a journalist in the 1960s, so you're writing about a time in which you worked and lived as a working adult. Did you come across anything that surprised you? Any of your discussions with the cast of characters from that time kind of shock you or startle you?
I was, I suppose, mostly surprised by what I would describe as a recalibration of some people on the left, that they realize now that they had tactics but not strategy. They didn't know where they wanted to end up. They were young, they had no real experience, they were outraged by the war, and they were unhappy with a lot of the institutions of American life, and so they threw their bodies into the system. But they didn't have plan B in mind. And I think that they believe that they paid a political consequence for that in terms of how the nation made a turn. I often say to people that I knew during the 60s, is this what you had in mind? Richard Nixon getting elected twice, Ronald Reagan getting elected twice, the Bush father and son getting elected 3 times between them, and more Republicans were elected and more conservative were elected in the aftermath of the 60s than anyone might have imagined at the time.
So you have been describing some of the ways in which we're seeing the result of the 60s today and some of those issues still playing out today. The 60s and into the early 70s were obviously a time of major upheaval culturally and in society, and we now have our first African-American president. Is the United States poised for other big changes, kind of like we saw in the 60s and 70s, because we've got some of those similarities?
I'm going to talk about that here at the library. I do think that we're going through a reset in every conceivable way. Obviously, economically, I think we are going through it politically, culturally again, in terms of what people's expectations are of their own contributions to society and what they expect of others. We're living in a much different world than we were in the 1960s. The planet, as I like to say, is smaller and much more crowded and hotter now than it was then. So we have some very big choices before us. And my guess is, and one is always at peril in trying to anticipate how historians will judge this time, but I think that this could turn out to be a historic passage. How it will turn out, I cannot say.
Who were some of the people that you talked to for the book?
Well, I talked to a lot of people. If you begin with the Civil Rights Movement, which was the most important movement to come out of the 60s, Andrew Young and a lot of members of what I call the movement, Cleveland Sellers and John Lewis and others who were there on the front lines at the time. And I talked to Gloria Steinem and Joan Baez, who were women who were changing the impression of the role of women in our society. I talked at length to Pat Buchanan, who was on the right and at Richard Nixon's side. There was a man by the name of Tom Turnipseed, who was the communications director for George Wallace, and he went through a 180. He changed his mind entirely about the place of race in our lives. Paul Simon, James Taylor, Judy Collins, I suppose the one indivisible fact of the 60s is that everyone agrees the music was fantastic. And however they may have felt politically at the time or culturally, they can still hear those songs in their mind.
There was definitely a soundtrack to the time.
Oh, there certainly was. And what's pretty amazing, I actually talked to Bruce Springsteen about this. He was in high school at the time, but he wanted to get onto the big stage, and he did. He was not a user of drugs, but he said, if you think back on it, and this is true with Paul and with James and with the other artists, Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones, even Neil Young, they are still extremely popular 40 years after they broke into the music scene. If in 1968 you had backed it up 40 years, it would have been 1928. There was nobody in 1928 who was still very popular in 1968.
Well, why do you think the staying power of some of those artists over these decades?
I think Judy Collins put it best. She said, we were telling our stories, the stories of our lives, and people responded to them. And then, too, they were all very gifted. When you think about their musicality, their ability to not only to sing, but to compose, the Beatles came along just a little bit later than that, obviously. But they were in the midst of it as well, and the Stones still define rock and roll for a lot of people. Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, who lived with him for a while, said he had a rainbow pen, which I think is a pretty apt way of describing how he could write.
One thing that was also true about the 60s, I mean, the media landscape was very different. You had your network newscasts, you had newspapers, you had radio news, and of course now there's a proliferation of all kinds of media outlets, but we're seeing networks and others struggling during these times. And I'm wondering, network newscasts, other programs that are ad revenue dependent, do you see those surviving some of the changes you were alluding to earlier?
I think we're on a journey to an unknown destination. I've been thinking about this a lot. I don't think journalism will go away. God, I hope it won't go away, not just because I have a selfish interest in it, but it really is important to a democratic republic to have strong, independent journalistic voices to tell people what's going on in their name at the highest and lowest levels of government. You know, in the 1960s, I was working for NBC, and I've often said we were a duopoly. It was really NBC and CBS. ABC was not much of a player in the news business. I kind of like that. I mean, the free market advocates may say we should have more, but, the fact is that we had a lot of money. We could go do the things we want to do, and most important, at 5:30 in the Midwest, 6:30 in the East, and at different time zones across the country, families would sit down and watch Walter Cronkite or Chet Huntley and David Brinkley to get a fix on what was going on that day. I think we're better off now. I like the Tom Paine environment as I describe it. There's something on every street corner. You have to be much more, I suppose the word is, proactive as a viewer or as a reader to determine who's credible, who meets your needs, and work a lot harder at it. I said to a financial group recently, you have to vet the news the same way you would any kind of a business deal. You just don't sit down and take it in.
Well, how do you vet the news each day? What are your sources of daily news intake?
Well, I have a wide range. I'm not just because I'm sitting across from you, I'm a big fan of public radio, and I have been for a long time. I grew up in radio, so I've always loved the medium. I was listening to Scott Simon over the weekend, for example, and it was just one interesting interview after another. I was on a long drive in my car, and I thought, this is not wasted time. He's really getting me through this, not just entertaining me, but expanding my horizons. So I think radio is very important. I like NPR. I'm still adjusting to satellite radio, about where that comes from. What I suppose I lament most of all is that you could drive across America, and in small or mid-sized cities, you'd have the local radio station, and they played the local playlist, and you found out what was going on. I even like to listen to the swap shop, as they called it. You could find out who was selling the lawnmower and who had a Harley that he'd over leveraged and was trying to get rid of that. I miss that kind of parochial approach that radio had. And then when it comes to printed publications, a wide range, obviously. The Times, the New York Times, I live in New York, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. The Economist is a publication that's doing very well in this environment. Its circulation is up almost 9%, and with good reason. It's very analytical. And you can read The Economist from cover to cover and be a pretty informed citizen. So I take it in from all sides, and I Google. I go on blogs. I find some of them terribly self-absorbed and kind of rants more than they are enlightening. But I'm interested in what they have to say.
Tom Brokaw, thank you so much for your time today.
It's my pleasure.